Jactor, my son-in-law said my car needed maintenance to keep me safe before my weekend trip. The next day when I picked it up, I dropped my purse and bent down to grab it. That's when I found a tracker hidden under the vehicle. Instead of confronting him, I quietly removed it and attached it to a semi-truck heading to Canada. The next day, I got a strange call from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police saying they'd arrested a man with my photo. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me backtrack and tell you how I got to this point. Because honey, this story has more layers than my grandmother's 7-layer cake, and trust me, that thing was a masterpiece. I'm Clara Brennan, 63 years old, and I've been a widow for exactly 2 years, 3 months, and 12 days. Not that I'm counting or anything, but when you've been married to someone for 38 years, you tend to notice when they're suddenly not snoring next to you every morning. My husband Richard died of a heart attack while mowing the lawn, which, knowing Richard, was probably exactly how he would have wanted to go. Quick, efficient, and with a perfectly manicured yard as his final accomplishment. Now, before you start thinking this is going to be some sob story about a poor little old lady, let me set the record straight. Richard might have been the one who fixed the leaky faucets and programmed the remote control, but I was the one who handled our finances. And by handled, I mean I turned his modest engineering salary and my teaching income into a portfolio worth approximately $8 million. Turns out, while Richard was building bridges, I was building our future. Who knew that all those summers spent listening to my father discuss stock markets over Sunday dinner would actually pay off? The thing about being a wealthy widow is that people suddenly start caring about your well-being in ways they never did before. Take my son-in-law David, for instance. 3 years ago, when my daughter Emma first brought him home, he couldn't have cared less about my car maintenance schedule. Now, suddenly, he's Marcus Aurelius crossed with a IAA service representative, full of wisdom about oil changes and tire rotations. David Mitchell is what my generation would call easy on the eyes. 37 years old, works in financial planning, drives a BMW that's always spotless, and has the kind of smile that makes waitresses give him extra bread rolls. Emma met him at some charity gala, where rich people pay $500 to eat rubber chicken and feel good about themselves. She was smitten from day one, which should have been my first warning sign. Emma's never been smitten by anything that wasn't bad for her. My only child has always had a talent for choosing men the way some people choose lottery numbers, with hope, enthusiasm, and absolutely no logic whatsoever. There was Marcus the musician, who turned out to be married, Brett the businessman, who turned out to be broke, and Kevin the entrepreneur, who turned out to be selling essential oils to his grandmother's bridge club. So when Emma walked through my door 3.5 years ago with David in tow, I was prepared for the worst. But David seemed different. He asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from previous conversations, and actually helped clear the table without being asked. He brought me flowers on Mother's Day, not the gas station variety, but actual arrangements from a real florist. He listened when I talked about Richard's death and never once suggested that I should start dating again or shouldn't waste my golden years alone. Most importantly, he made Emma happy. Really, genuinely happy, not the manic kind of happy she'd displayed with the others. She glowed when she talked about him. And for the first time in years, our Sunday dinners included someone who actually wanted to be there. So when David suggested last Friday that my car needed maintenance before my weekend business trip to Portland, I didn't question it. I should have, but grief and loneliness have a way of making you grateful for any sign that someone cares about your safety. Even if that someone has only been family for 3 years and has never shown any previous interest in automotive maintenance. Clara, he'd said, using that concerned son-in-law voice that I was still getting used to. When's the last time you had the oil changed in that Lexus? You're driving 3 hours each way to Portland, and I'd hate for something to happen to you on the road. Emma had nodded along enthusiastically from the kitchen counter, where she was attempting to make what she optimistically called gourmet grilled cheese. Mom, David knows about cars. You should listen to him. And that's how I found myself handing over my keys to a man who, until that moment, I'd trusted completely. Trust, as it turns out, is a luxury I could no longer afford. But that Friday evening, I was still blissfully unaware of what was coming. I went to bed thinking about my Saturday morning appointment with Henderson Financial Group, the potential merger that could add another $1 million to my portfolio, and whether I remembered to pack my good reading glasses. I did not go to sleep wondering whether my son-in-law was planning to have me kidnapped, robbed, or worse. Hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. But sometimes, hindsight is also the thing that saves your life. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes you believe in new beginnings, which seems ironic now considering what I was about to discover. I'd always been an early riser, a habit left over from 35 years of teaching high school history, where arriving late meant facing down 200 caffeinated teenagers who could sense weakness like sharks smell blood in the water. My house was quiet in the way that only truly expensive houses can be. Double-pane windows, quality insulation, and thick walls that Richard had insisted on when we'd built the place 25 years ago. "Clara," he'd said back then, "if we're going to build our dream house, let's build it right." The man might have been stubborn about loading the dishwasher correctly, but he'd had excellent taste in contractors. The garage door hummed open, revealing my spotless silver Lexus ES 350. David had brought it back the previous evening, keys handed over with a pleased smile and a detailed explanation of everything the mechanics had supposedly checked. Oil, filters, belts, the whole 9 yards, he'd said. Should run like a dream now. I'd thanked him, thinking what a thoughtful man my daughter had chosen. Shows you how much I knew. The drive to my first appointment should have taken 20 minutes, but traffic had other plans. Some genius had decided that Saturday morning was the perfect time to repave half of downtown Portland. So I found myself crawling along Elm Street at approximately the speed of continental drift, which was fine with me, actually. At 63, I'd learned that being early to a meeting was a power move, but being fashionably on time was an art form. Portland Financial Group occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building that probably cost more to clean than most people earn in a year. I'd been working with Henderson Financial for the past 6 months on what they called a strategic acquisition opportunity, and what I called buying a company because I could. The truth was, after Richard died, I discovered that sitting around feeling sorry for myself was both boring and financially unproductive. Turns out, making money is an excellent distraction from grief. The elevator whisked me up to the 15th floor, where Margaret Henderson was waiting with the kind of smile that costs extra at expensive dental practices. Margaret was everything I wasn't. Blonde, 30-something, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But she was also brilliant, ruthless, and completely honest about both those qualities. I respected that. Clara, right on time, as always. She stood up from behind a desk that was large enough to land a small aircraft. "I have excellent news about the Riverside Properties acquisition." For the next 2 hours, we discussed numbers, projections, and the kind of legal details that would put most people to sleep, but made my accountant's heart sing with joy. The short version was that I was about to become the proud owner of a commercial real estate portfolio that would generate enough passive income to fund Emma's shopping habits for the next century. Not that she knew about any of this, of course. One thing I'd learned from watching Richard handle money for 38 years was that financial information should be shared on a need-to-know basis. Emma needed to know that she was loved, supported, and that her mother wasn't going to end up eating cat food in her golden years. She did not need to know that her mother could buy and sell small countries. The second appointment was with Davidson Investment Management, where I was considering moving some of my more aggressive investments. Jason Davidson was one of those 28-year-old financial wonders who wore expensive watches and talked about disrupting traditional portfolio management. Normally, I avoided doing business with anyone who used disrupt as a verb, but Jason had made me 17% returns last year, which purchased a lot of tolerance for trendy vocabulary. By the time I finished both meetings, it was nearly 3 o'clock, and I was ready to head home. Emma was making dinner for David and me. Something she'd started doing every Saturday since they got engaged. It was sweet, really, even though Emma's cooking skills were roughly equivalent to her ability to parallel park. Technically possible, but requiring multiple attempts and a lot of prayer. I walked out to the parking garage, my mind already shifting from business mode to family mode, thinking about whether I should stop and pick up dessert to supplement whatever Emma was attempting in my kitchen. That's when I made the mistake that probably saved my life. As I approached my car, I fumbled with my purse while trying to extract my keys, my reading glasses, and my parking ticket simultaneously. This is why women's purses are basically portable storage units. We never know what emergency might require immediate access to lip balm, antacids, or in this case, car keys buried under a pharmacy's worth of receipts. The purse fell. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just the regular kind of middle-aged woman dropping her purse because she was trying to juggle too many things at once. Tissues scattered, pens rolled, and my reading glasses case bounced twice before coming to rest under my car. I bent down to retrieve everything, muttering the kind of words that would have gotten me detention duty when I was teaching. That's when I saw it. Attached to the underside of my car, just behind the front wheel well, was a small black device about the size of a deck of cards. It was magnetic, clearly designed to be hidden, and it definitely hadn't been there 2 days ago when I dropped my parking permit in this same garage and had to crawl around looking for it. For a moment, I just stared at it, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. Then very slowly, I reached out and pulled it free. It came away easily, and there was no question what it was. A GPS tracker. Someone, and I had a pretty good idea who, wanted to know where I was going. I sat in my car for approximately 10 minutes, staring at that tracker like it was a particularly venomous spider that had just crawled out of my coffee cup. Part of me wanted to march straight back into the financial building, call David, and demand an explanation. But 35 years of teaching teenagers had taught me that the direct approach wasn't always the smartest approach, especially when dealing with someone who might be playing a longer game than you realized. Instead, I did what any reasonable woman would do. I Googled GPS tracker on my phone. 20 minutes later, I knew more about covert surveillance devices than most private investigators. Turns out, you can buy these things on Amazon for less than $50, and they're marketed to concerned parents and security-conscious businesses. The model stuck to my car was a Silent Tracker Pro, which promised real-time location updates and 6 months of battery life. How thoughtful of David to spring for the premium option. The question was what to do about it. My first instinct was to call Emma, but that would put her in an impossible position between her mother and her fiancé. My second instinct was to confront David directly, but that assumed he was working alone, which might not be the case. And my third instinct, which was starting to seem like the smartest option, was to turn this little spy game around on whoever was playing it. You see, one advantage of being a wealthy widow is that people tend to underestimate you. They assume that because you're over 60 and female, you're automatically helpless, confused, and ripe for manipulation. What they don't realize is that I've spent the last 40 years dealing with teenagers, tax auditors, and insurance companies. I know how to spot a con artist, and I know how to outmaneuver them. I drove to Radio Shack. Yes, they still exist, barely, and purchased a small magnetic case, some industrial adhesive, and a prepaid cell phone. Then I drove to the truck stop on Highway 84, where long-haul truckers grabbed coffee and diesel fuel before heading out on cross-country routes. The plan was simple. I would attach David's tracker to a truck, heading somewhere far, far away, and then see what happened when my supposed location started moving in directions I'd never intended to go. If David was tracking me for innocent reasons, which seemed about as likely as Emma developing actual cooking skills, then nothing would happen. But if he was tracking me for less innocent reasons, well, then things might get very interesting very quickly. I selected a truck with Canadian plates and a license that indicated it was heading to Vancouver. Perfect. I attached the tracker to the underside of the trailer, said a little prayer that I wasn't about to cause an international incident, and drove home to see what would happen next. The drive back gave me time to think, which wasn't necessarily a blessing, because the more I thought about David's sudden interest in my car maintenance, the more other little details started clicking into place, like how he'd started asking questions about my investment portfolio during family dinners. Nothing obvious, just casual inquiries about whether I was diversifying properly, and if I'd considered updating my estate planning. At the time, I'd assumed he was being professionally helpful, since financial planning was his job. Now, I wondered if he was conducting reconnaissance, or how he'd volunteered to help me organize Richard's papers after the funeral, and had seemed particularly interested in the life insurance documents and bank statements. I'd been grateful for the help at the time, since grief had turned my normal organizational skills into something resembling a toddler's toy box. But looking back, David had spent an awful lot of time photographing documents for your records with his phone. Then there was the way he'd encouraged Emma to move back in with me after their engagement, suggesting it would be good for both of us if she stayed in her childhood room for a few months while they planned the wedding. Emma, who'd been living independently since college, had seemed surprised by the suggestion, but had gone along with it because David was so thoughtful about family relationships. Now I wondered if having Emma in my house was less about thoughtfulness and more about having an inside source for my daily routines, travel plans, and general vulnerabilities. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd worked myself into the kind of cold fury that makes smart women dangerous. But I'd also made a decision. If David was playing games with me, I was going to play them right back, and I was going to win. Because here's what David didn't know about me. I might be a 63-year-old widow, but I was also a woman who'd managed to turn a teacher's salary into an $8 million fortune without anyone noticing. I'd outmaneuvered IRS auditors, outsmarted investment scammers, and negotiated business deals with men who assumed I didn't understand basic math. If David thought he could manipulate me because I was old, female, and recently widowed, he was about to learn exactly how wrong a smart man could be. I walked into my house, hugged my daughter, complimented her on whatever she was burning in the kitchen, and smiled at my son-in-law like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I just wasn't ready to let him know that yet. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of deceptive calm that should have warned me something was about to go spectacularly wrong. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee from Richard's favorite mug, the one with "World's Most Adequate Husband" that Emma had given him years ago, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a 780 area code. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something about the timing made me answer. "Mrs. Brennan? This is Sergeant Mitchell Wright with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Alberta, Canada." I nearly dropped the coffee mug. In all my scenarios about what might happen when David discovered his tracker was heading to Canada, a call from the actual police hadn't made the list. "Yes, this is Clara Brennan," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is everything all right, Sergeant?" "Ma'am, we have a situation here that you might be able to help us with. Early this morning, we arrested a man named Vincent Torres at a truck stop outside Calgary. He was behaving suspiciously around one of the trucks, and when we searched him, we found a photograph of you, along with some rather detailed personal information." My blood turned to ice water. "I'm sorry. What?" "Mrs. Brennan, this individual had your home address, your daily routine, information about your car, and what appears to be surveillance notes dating back several weeks. When we confronted him about how he'd obtained this information, he became extremely agitated and started demanding to speak with someone named David about a payment he was owed." I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, my mind racing. "Sergeant Wright, I think I need to tell you something important." For the next 20 minutes, I told Sergeant Wright about the tracker, about David's suspicious behavior, and about my growing suspicions that my son-in-law might not have my best interests at heart. To his credit, Sergeant Wright took notes without judgment and asked the kinds of detailed questions that suggested he'd dealt with elder fraud cases before. "Mrs. Brennan," he said finally, "based on what you've told me and what we've found here, I believe you may be the target of a sophisticated scam. This Vincent Torres has a criminal record for robbery, assault, and something we call virtual kidnapping, where criminals track potential victims and then demand ransom from family members by claiming the person has been abducted. Virtual kidnapping? The term sounded like something from a science fiction movie. It's more common than you'd think, especially targeting elderly individuals with significant assets. The criminals track the target's movements, wait until they're traveling alone, and then contact family members claiming they've been kidnapped and demanding immediate payment. By the time anyone realizes it's fake, the money's long gone. The implications hit me like a physical blow. So David was planning to... We can't know for certain without more investigation, but it appears someone provided Mr. Torres with detailed information about your movements and financial situation. The good news is that we caught him before anything happened, and he's been very motivated to provide information about who hired him. What did he tell you? He claims he was hired through an encrypted messaging app by someone calling himself DM. He was given $5,000 up front and promised another $20,000 once the job was completed. The plan was for him to intercept you during your business trip, contact your family claiming you'd been kidnapped, and demand $200,000 for your release. I felt sick. $200,000. Mrs. Brennan, given what we've uncovered, I strongly recommend you contact local law enforcement immediately. If Mr. Torres is telling the truth, you're in immediate danger. The person who hired him, this DM, is probably expecting Torres to check in about the success of the operation. When he doesn't hear anything, they're going to realize something went wrong. And then what? Then they might try a different approach. Mrs. Brennan, people who are desperate enough to arrange kidnappings don't usually give up when Plan A fails. They move to Plan B. After I hung up with Sergeant Wright, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at my coffee and trying to process what I'd learned. David Mitchell, DM, had hired someone to kidnap me. Not just rob me, not just con me out of money, but actually kidnap me and terrorize my family into paying a ransom. The plan was diabolically clever, actually. Emma would have been frantic when I disappeared. She would have called David immediately, and he would have been right there to handle the situation and deal with the kidnappers. He probably would have insisted on paying the ransom himself to protect Emma from the trauma of handling the negotiations. $200,000 would have been painful, but not devastating to my finances. Emma would have been grateful to David for handling everything, and I would have been so traumatized by the experience that I'd probably have become even more dependent on both of them. Except for one small problem with David's perfect plan. I'd found the tracker. Now the question was, what to do next? Sergeant Wright had advised me to contact local police, which was probably the smart, responsible thing to do. But the smart, responsible thing wouldn't necessarily give me the answers I needed, like whether Emma was involved, how long David had been planning this, or if this was his first attempt to steal from me. More importantly, the smart, responsible thing wouldn't give me the chance to turn the tables on David and show him exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who survived 6 decades of men thinking they're smarter than she is. I looked at Richard's picture on the mantelpiece, the one where he's holding a fish he'd caught on our anniversary trip to Lake Tahoe. Richard had been a good man, but he'd also been a cautious man. He would have called the police immediately and let them handle everything. But Richard was gone, and I was tired of being cautious. I was about to do something that would either be very smart or very stupid, and I honestly wasn't sure which. But after spending 2 years playing the role of the grieving widow who needed everyone else's help and protection, I was ready to remind the world that I was a force to be reckoned with. David wanted to play games with me? Fine. But this time I was going to make the rules. 1. By Monday morning, I'd formulated what I charitably called a plan and what a reasonable person might have called a recipe for disaster. But reasonable people, in my experience, don't end up with $8 million and a son-in-law plotting their kidnapping, so I figured I was operating outside the realm of conventional wisdom anyway. The first step was information gathering. If David was bold enough to hire kidnappers, he was probably bold enough to have tried other schemes. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made my next move. I started with a phone call to my accountant, Harold Finch, who'd been handling my taxes since Clinton was president and who had the personality of a particularly thorough accountant, which is to say he remembered every detail of every financial transaction I'd ever made. Harold, I need you to do me a favor, I said, sitting in my home office with the door locked and my voice low enough that Emma couldn't overhear from the kitchen. I need you to go through my accounts for the past 3 years and look for anything unusual. Any transactions I might not have initiated, any changes to direct deposits, anything that seems off. Clara, is everything all right? This sounds like you think someone might be... I think someone might be stealing from me. Yes, and I need to know how much and for how long. Harold promised to call me back within 2 hours, which was one of the reasons I'd been using him for 20 years. The man understood urgency. Next, I called my attorney, Susan Martinez, who had the advantage of being both extremely competent and completely unimpressed by men who thought they were cleverer than they actually were. Susan, I need you to conduct a background check on someone for me. David Mitchell, 37 years old, works for Premier Financial Planning, engaged to my daughter Emma. Clara, what's going on? This doesn't sound like a routine legal consultation. I gave Susan an abbreviated version of the tracker story and the phone call from Canada, leaving out the part where I'd decided to handle things myself rather than involving the police immediately. Susan listened with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of dealing with clients who've discovered their lives aren't what they thought they were. Clara, I want you to promise me something. Promise me you won't confront this man alone, and promise me you'll involve law enforcement if this gets dangerous. I promise I won't do anything stupid, I said, which wasn't exactly the same thing, but seemed to satisfy Susan for the moment. By noon, I had my answers, and they were worse than I'd expected. Harold called first. Clara, you're going to want to sit down for this. Over the past 18 months, someone has been making small withdrawals from your checking account. Nothing large enough to trigger automatic alerts, but consistent enough to add up. We're talking about approximately $37,000. My stomach dropped. How is that possible? I monitor my accounts religiously. The withdrawals were made using electronic transfers that were coded to look like routine bill payments. Utilities, insurance, property taxes, the kind of recurring expenses that most people don't scrutinize closely. Whoever did this knew exactly how much you typically spend on monthly expenses and stayed just under the radar. Harold, the only people who would know that level of detail about my finances would be family members or your financial advisor. Yes, Clara, this isn't the work of some random scammer. This is someone with intimate access to your financial information. Susan called 20 minutes later with information that made Harold's news look like a minor inconvenience. Clara, your future son-in-law is not who he says he is. David Mitchell does work for Premier Financial Planning, but he was hired only 8 months ago, and he was fired from his previous 2 jobs for what the HR departments tactfully called inappropriate client interactions. Which means what exactly? Which means he was caught trying to manipulate elderly clients into questionable investment strategies that would benefit him personally. He's also got serious gambling debts. We're talking about 6 figures owed to some very unpleasant people in Atlantic City. The pieces were falling into place with the kind of horrible clarity that makes you wish you'd never started asking questions. How much does he owe? Close to $300,000. Based on court filings from a civil suit last year. Clara, this man didn't fall in love with your daughter's sparkling personality. He fell in love with your financial statements. That afternoon, I sat in my living room, drinking tea and trying to decide whether I was angrier about the theft, the attempted kidnapping, or the fact that my daughter was about to marry a con man who'd been stealing from her mother for over a year. Emma was upstairs, happily planning a wedding to a man who'd probably been planning to rob us blind from the moment he walked through my front door. David was at work, presumably conducting more inappropriate client interactions, while his hired kidnapper sat in a Canadian jail cell, probably wondering why his easy payday had gone so wrong. And I was sitting in my house, looking at family photos and realizing that everything I'd believed about my life for the past 3 years had been carefully constructed lies. But here's the thing about being 63 years old and financially independent. You develop a certain perspective on problems. You realize that being angry is useful only if it motivates you to take action. And you realize that the best revenge is not getting mad. It's getting even. David thought he was playing chess with a naive widow who wouldn't recognize a con game if it came with an instruction manual. What he didn't realize is that I'd spent 40 years playing chess with teenagers, and teenagers are infinitely more devious than amateur con artists. It was time to show David exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who's had 2 years to perfect the art of being underestimated. The game was about to change, and this time, I was going to be the one making the moves. Tuesday morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from having a purpose beyond survival. For 2 years, I'd been drifting through my days like a ghost, haunting my own life, going through the motions of living without actually engaging with the world. But discovering that my son-in-law was a lying, stealing, kidnapping con artist had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing: a worthy opponent. I made coffee, read the financial news, and waited for Emma to leave for her job at the marketing firm downtown. Once her car disappeared around the corner, I got to work. My first call was to Detective Sarah Chen at Portland Police Department, because despite my newfound taste for vigilante justice, I wasn't completely reckless. Sergeant Wright in Canada had given me her contact information, and she'd been expecting my call. Mrs. Brennan, I've already spoken with the RCMP about your situation. Based on what they've told me and the evidence they've collected, we have enough to arrest David Mitchell immediately. When would you like us to bring him in? Actually, Detective Chen, I'd like to hold off on that for a few days. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Mrs. Brennan, this man hired someone to kidnap you. He's been stealing from you for months. Why would you want to delay his arrest? Because I want to make sure we get everything. If we arrest David now, we'll get him for the kidnapping plot and the theft, but we won't know if there are other victims, other schemes, or other people involved. I'd like to give him enough rope to hang himself completely. That's inadvisable and potentially dangerous. Detective, I've been dealing with dangerous people for 40 years. They were just smaller and had better excuses for their behavior. I can handle David Mitchell for a few more days. What I didn't tell Detective Chen was that I'd already started implementing my own investigation. While she was worried about my safety, I was worried about my dignity. David had made the mistake of thinking he was smarter than me, and I intended to prove exactly how wrong he was before the police led him away in handcuffs. After hanging up with Detective Chen, I made my second call of the day. This one to Marcus Webb at Webb Investigations. Marcus was a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate fraud and had helped me investigate a potential business partner's background 2 years ago. He had the kind of methodical approach to gathering evidence that I appreciated, plus he charged reasonable fees and didn't talk down to clients who happened to be female and over 60. Clara, good to hear from you. Please tell me this isn't another due diligence request. I'm still recovering from the last merger you asked me to investigate. Actually, Marcus, this is personal. I need you to conduct comprehensive surveillance on someone, and I need it done without them knowing they're being watched. Uh-oh. This sounds like family trouble. For the next 30 minutes, I explained the David situation to Marcus, who listened with the kind of professional calm that comes from having seen every possible variation of human betrayal during a 20-year law enforcement career. Clara, what you're describing is a classic long-term elder fraud scheme, but with some unusual sophistication. Most con artists who target seniors are looking for quick scores. This David has been playing a 3-year game, which suggests either exceptional patience or exceptional desperation. My money's on desperation. Apparently, he owes $300,000 to people who aren't known for their understanding nature. That would do it. Clara, I can have surveillance on this guy within 24 hours, but I have to ask, why not just let the police handle it? You've got enough evidence to put him away already. Because I want to understand the full scope of what he's been doing, and because I want to make sure Emma is protected from whatever consequences come next. What I didn't tell Marcus was that I also wanted David to experience the same sense of helplessness and violation that I'd felt when I discovered his tracker. I wanted him to know what it was like to have someone watching his every move, gathering evidence of his secrets, and preparing to destroy his carefully constructed lies. Call it petty revenge or call it justice. But either way, David Mitchell was about to learn that stealing from the wrong widow could be a very expensive mistake. My third call was to Jennifer Walsh, a financial forensics specialist who'd helped me untangle a particularly complex investment fraud case several years ago. Jennifer had the ability to follow money trails through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. Jennifer, I need you to conduct a complete financial investigation on someone. Bank records, credit reports, investment accounts, property holdings, everything you can legally access. Clara, you know I love a challenge, but this sounds like it's going to keep me busy for weeks. What kind of timeline are we talking about? I need preliminary results in 48 hours and a complete report within a week. That's ambitious. This is going to cost you. Money is not a concern. Accuracy and speed are my only priorities. By noon, I had 3 professionals working to gather information that would either confirm my suspicions about David or reveal that the situation was even worse than I'd imagined. Now came the hardest part, acting normal around Emma and David while I waited for the investigation results. Emma came home for lunch, which she'd started doing since moving back in with me, ostensibly to check on me, but really because the office cafeteria served food that could generously be described as nutritional punishment. She sat at my kitchen counter, eating a sandwich and chattering about her wedding plans while I made all the appropriate maternal responses. "Mom, David thinks we should have the reception at the Riverside Country Club. It's gorgeous, but it's so expensive. Are you sure you want to contribute that much to the wedding?" The irony was almost too much to bear. David was stealing from me to pay his gambling debts while simultaneously planning an elaborate wedding funded by my stolen money. The audacity was actually impressive in a sociopathic sort of way. "Sweetheart, it's your wedding. I want it to be perfect, regardless of the cost." "You're the best mom in the world," Emma said, hugging me with the kind of grateful affection that made me want to protect her from the truth for as long as possible. But protection, I was learning, sometimes requires destruction first, and David Mitchell was about to discover that some widows bite back. Wednesday evening brought the first piece of Marcus Webb's surveillance report, and it confirmed that my instincts about David had been catastrophically under-optimistic. Apparently, hiring kidnappers was just the latest escalation in a criminal career that had been building momentum for years. I sat in my home office, reading Marcus's preliminary findings while Emma and David had dinner at some trendy restaurant downtown. They'd invited me, of course, but I'd begged off with a headache, which wasn't entirely fabricated, given what I was learning about my future son-in-law. According to Marcus, David had spent Tuesday visiting 3 locations that were extremely interesting from an investigative standpoint: a storage unit facility on the outskirts of town, a private mailbox service that specialized in providing anonymous addresses for a fee, and a meeting with 2 men at a coffee shop who had criminal records for loan sharking and money laundering. "Clara," Marcus had written in his report, "your son-in-law is operating what appears to be a sophisticated financial fraud operation. The storage unit contains boxes of documents, possibly stolen financial records from other victims. The mailbox service is the kind used by people who don't want their real addresses associated with their business activities. And the 2 men he met with are both associates of Tony Marchetti, who runs the largest illegal gambling operation on the East Coast." Tony Marchetti. Even I knew that name, and I made it a point to avoid knowing the names of criminals. Marchetti was the kind of man who appeared in newspaper articles about federal investigations and mysteriously disappeared witnesses. If David owed money to Marchetti's organization, he wasn't just desperate, he was probably terrified. Jennifer Walsh's financial investigation had uncovered equally disturbing information. David didn't just have gambling debts. He had a pattern of targeting elderly women with significant assets, gaining their trust, and then systematically draining their accounts. I was apparently victim number 4 in what appeared to be a career spanning nearly a decade. "Clara, this man is a professional," Jennifer had told me during our phone call that afternoon. "He's sophisticated, patient, and extremely dangerous. The previous 3 women he targeted all lost substantial amounts of money. One woman lost her entire life savings of $400,000 before her family discovered what was happening. What happened to him after that? Nothing. The woman was too ashamed to press charges, and by the time her family got involved, David had moved to a different state and started over with a new identity. This is his 4th identity that I've been able to trace. 4th identity. That meant David Mitchell wasn't even his real name, which explained why Emma had never been able to find any trace of his family or childhood friends when she'd tried to plan bachelor party activities with his old buddies. By Thursday morning, I had enough evidence to put David away for decades, but I also had a new problem. According to Marcus's surveillance, David was getting nervous. He'd been making unusual phone calls, visiting his storage unit multiple times, and had booked a flight to Miami for the following Monday, a flight that Emma knew nothing about. Detective Chen called me Thursday afternoon with an update from Canada that made the situation even more urgent. "Mrs. Brennan, Vincent Torres has been very cooperative with our investigation. He's provided detailed information about his communications with the person who hired him, including email chains and voice recordings. The problem is, Torres claims he was supposed to call his employer every day to report on the surveillance progress. He missed yesterday's check-in because, obviously, he's in jail, which means David knows something went wrong." "Exactly. Mrs. Brennan, we think he may be preparing to disappear. Based on what Torres has told us, Your son-in-law has an escape plan that involves liquidating assets quickly and leaving the country. If he runs, we may never catch him, and you may never recover your stolen money." That afternoon, I made a decision that was either brilliantly strategic or incredibly stupid. Instead of calling the police to arrest David immediately, I decided to accelerate my own timeline. I called Emma at work and asked her to bring David over for dinner Friday night. "I want to discuss the wedding budget," I told her, which was true in a way that would become clear very soon. "Mom, that's so sweet of you. David will be thrilled. He's been worried about the expenses." I bet he has. Friday evening, I prepared what I privately called my last supper: roast chicken with all the accompaniments, David's favorite wine, and chocolate cake from the bakery Emma loved. If this was going to be our final family dinner, I wanted it to be memorable. Emma arrived first, bubbling with excitement about wedding plans, and completely oblivious to the fact that her fiancé was a career criminal who'd been planning to kidnap her mother. David arrived 20 minutes later, carrying flowers and wearing the kind of smile that I now recognized as his manipulating elderly women expression. "Clara, you look wonderful tonight," he said, kissing my cheek with the kind of practiced warmth that had fooled me for 3 years. "Emma tells me you want to discuss wedding plans." "Among other things," I said, leading them into the dining room where I'd set the table with my best china and crystal. I thought it was time we had a family conversation about the future. During dinner, I watched David perform his caring son-in-law routine with new eyes. The way he asked about my health, his concern about my living alone, his suggestions about simplifying my financial portfolio, it was all part of a script designed to make me dependent on his help and guidance. But I also watched Emma, and what I saw broke my heart. She genuinely loved this man. She laughed at his jokes, sought his approval for her opinions, and looked at him with the kind of trust that comes from believing you've found your person. When this all came out, it was going to destroy her faith in her own judgment, possibly for years. After dessert, I poured brandy for David and myself while Emma cleared the dishes, and then I said the words that would change everything. "David, I need to ask you about something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer." His smile flickered slightly, but held. "Of course, Clara. What's on your mind?" "I need to know why you put a GPS tracker on my car." The silence that followed my question was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway and Emma loading dishes in the dishwasher. David's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, confusion, calculation, before settling on what I'd learned to recognize as his concerned and slightly hurt look. "Clara, I'm not sure what you mean. A GPS tracker? The one you had attached to my car when you took it for maintenance last week. The one that I found in the parking garage in Portland. The one that's currently traveling through the Canadian wilderness attached to a semi-truck bound for Vancouver." Emma appeared in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, looking confused. "Mom, what are you talking about? David, why would you put a tracker on Mom's car?" David reached for Emma's hand, his voice taking on the tone of a man dealing with a confused elderly relative. "Sweetheart, I think your mother might be a little mixed up. I never put any tracker on her car." "Really?" I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken of the device. "Because I have pictures, and I have a very interesting police report from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police about a man named Vincent Torres who was arrested carrying my photograph and detailed surveillance notes about my daily routines." Emma's face went white. "Police report? Mom, what's going on?" David's mask was slipping now, his practiced calm giving way to something sharper and more desperate. "Clara, I think there might be some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, David, is the one you made when you assumed I was too old and trusting to notice that you've been stealing from me for 18 months. I pulled out a folder containing printouts of Harold's financial analysis and handed it to Emma. "Your fiancé has been making unauthorized withdrawals from my accounts totaling $37,000. He's also got gambling debts of nearly $300,000 owed to some very unpleasant people in Atlantic City." Emma looked at the papers, then at David, then back at me. "This can't be right. David, tell her this is wrong." But David wasn't denying anything anymore. Instead, he was staring at me with the kind of focused intensity that made me glad I'd already called Detective Chen and told her to be on standby. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. I started putting it together after I found the tracker. The phone call from Canadian police confirmed my suspicions, and the private investigators I hired filled in the rest. "Private investigators?" Emma's voice cracked. "Mom, what is happening?" I looked at my daughter, seeing her world crumble in real time, and felt a stab of guilt for handling this so brutally. But Emma needed to know exactly who she'd been planning to marry, and David needed to understand that his game was over. "Emma, sweetheart, David isn't who he claims to be. His real name is Derek Morrison, and over the past 10 years, he's targeted at least 3 other elderly women, convinced them to trust him, and then systematically stolen their life savings. I'm victim number 4, except I caught him before he could finish the job." Derek, stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "You don't understand, Clara. I never wanted to hurt you, but these people I owe money to, they don't accept excuses. They'll kill me if I don't pay them back. So you decided to solve your problems by kidnapping me and demanding ransom from Emma?" Emma dropped the folder, papers scattering across the floor. "Kidnapping? David, please tell me this isn't true." "It wasn't supposed to be real," David said desperately. "Vincent was just supposed to make some phone calls, demand money, and then let you go. No one was going to get hurt." The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Emma backed away from David as if he'd suddenly burst into flames, her face a mask of horror and betrayal. "You were going to fake kidnap my mother for money?" "Emma, please, I can explain." "Explain what?" Emma's voice rose to nearly a shout. "Explain how you've been stealing from my mother? Explain how you've been lying to me for 3 years? Explain how you were planning to terrorize me into thinking my mother was dead so you could steal money to pay your gambling debts?" David reached for her, but Emma jerked away from his touch. Don't you dare touch me." I felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak watching my daughter find her strength in that moment. For 3 years, Emma had deferred to David's judgment, sought his approval, shaped her opinions around his preferences. But confronted with the truth about who he really was, she was discovering that she was stronger than either of us had realized. "David," I said calmly, "I called the police 30 minutes before you arrived tonight. They're waiting outside for my signal. You have exactly 1 chance to do the right thing here." "Which is what?" "Confess to Emma. Tell her everything. About the other women you've robbed. About your real name. About how you plan to disappear after draining my accounts. Give her the respect of knowing exactly who she was about to marry." David looked at Emma, then at me, then at the folder of evidence scattered on my dining room floor. For a moment, I thought he might actually do it, might actually tell the truth and accept the consequences of his actions. Instead, he bolted for the back door. He made it approximately 15 feet across my backyard before Detective Chen and 2 uniformed officers tackled him next to Richard's prize-winning rose bushes. The arrest was swift, professional, and enormously satisfying to watch through my kitchen window. Emma stood beside me, tears streaming down her face, watching the man she'd planned to marry being read his rights and loaded into a police car. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I brought him into our lives. I trusted him. I almost let him destroy you." I put my arms around my daughter and held her while she cried. "Sweetheart, this isn't your fault. David is a professional con artist. Fooling people is what he does for a living. But I should have seen the signs. I should have protected you. Emma, you couldn't have known. And besides," I said, watching the police car disappear down our street with its very valuable cargo, "I protected myself just fine." 3 weeks after David's arrest, I was sitting in the office of Assistant District Attorney Patricia Hernandez, learning that my former son-in-law's criminal career had been even more impressive than I'd realized. The man I'd known as David Mitchell had actually been born Derek Morrison in Buffalo, New York, 42 years ago, making him 5 years older than he'd claimed and significantly more experienced in the art of defrauding elderly women. "Mrs. Brennan," Patricia said, spreading files across her conference table like a dealer shuffling cards, "we've been investigating Derek Morrison's activities for the past month, and what we've uncovered is frankly staggering. Your case was just the tip of the iceberg." She opened the first file, revealing a photograph of a woman who looked to be in her 70s, with kind eyes and silver hair arranged in a neat bun. "This is Margaret Wellington from Sarasota, Florida. Morrison targeted her 3 years ago, convinced her to invest her retirement savings in a fake real estate venture, and disappeared with $460,000. The second file contained a picture of another woman, this one younger, perhaps in her early 60s, with the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd worked hard for everything she'd earned. Helen Rodriguez from Phoenix, Arizona. Morrison convinced her he was a financial advisor who could help her maximize her deceased husband's life insurance payout. He made off with $320,000. The third file made my breath catch. The woman in the photograph couldn't have been more than 55, with dark hair and a warm smile that reminded me of Emma at that age. And this is Janet Pierce from Charleston, South Carolina, Morrison's most recent victim before you. He convinced her to liquidate her business to invest in his exclusive investment opportunities. She lost everything, her savings, her business, her house. She's currently living with her adult daughter and working retail at the age of 58. I stared at the photographs of Derek's victims, feeling a cold fury building in my chest. These weren't just statistics or case files. These were real women whose lives had been destroyed by a man I'd welcomed into my home and trusted with my daughter's happiness. How many others? I asked. We're still investigating, but we believe Morrison has been running these schemes for at least 12 years. Conservative estimate? 15 to 20 victims, total losses approaching $3 million. $3 million stolen from women who'd trusted the wrong man. Women who'd lost not just their money, but their security, their independence, and their faith in their own judgment. What happens to him now? Patricia's smile was the kind that suggested she enjoyed her job more than was probably healthy. Mrs. Brennan, Derek Morrison is looking at federal charges for wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and about a dozen other felonies. Even with the best lawyer money can buy, which he can't afford thanks to his gambling debts, he's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. And the other victims? That's actually why I asked you here today. Morrison had assets hidden in offshore accounts and safety deposit boxes that we've been able to recover. Not everything, but enough to provide partial restitution to his victims. However, there's a complication. Patricia pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the rest. Morrison claims that one of his victims was complicit in his schemes. He says that this woman knew he was defrauding others and helped him target new victims in exchange for a percentage of the profits. My blood ran cold. Who? He claims it was you, Mrs. Brennan. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The audacity was breathtaking, even by Derek's standards. He's claiming I was his accomplice? Morrison says that you discovered his criminal activities months ago, but agreed to keep quiet in exchange for a cut of his profits from future schemes. He claims the tracker incident was staged by both of you to throw off suspicion when the Canadian authorities got too close. I laughed. Actually laughed at the sheer ridiculousness of the accusation. Patricia, this man tried to kidnap me. He stole $37,000 from my accounts. He hired a criminal to terrorize my family. And now he's claiming I was his business partner? Morrison is desperate, Mrs. Brennan. He knows he's going to prison, so he's trying to drag down anyone he can reach. The good news is that his story doesn't hold water under examination. The evidence clearly shows you were a victim, not an accomplice. But Morrison has been very creative with his accusations. He's claiming that your investigation into his activities was too sophisticated for an ordinary victim. He says that no 63-year-old widow could have orchestrated the kind of counter-investigation that led to his arrest without professional help. I felt a chill of understanding. He's questioning how I was able to turn the tables on him so effectively. Exactly. Morrison's lawyer is going to argue that you must have had inside knowledge of his operations, possibly gained through a partnership that went sour. They're going to claim that you only turned against him when you realized you were about to be caught yourself. The irony was almost funny. Derek's downfall had come from underestimating me, and now he was making the same mistake in reverse, assuming that because I'd outsmarted him, I must have been as criminal as he was. Patricia, what do I need to do to prove I wasn't his accomplice? Actually, Mrs. Brennan, I think we should let Morrison's lawyer make that argument. Why? Patricia's smile turned predatory. Because when Derek Morrison takes the stand to testify that you were his criminal partner, he's going to have to explain in detail exactly how his schemes worked, who his other victims were, and how much money he stole from each of them. He'll have to provide evidence of his criminal enterprise in order to implicate you. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Derek could try to drag me down with him, but doing so would require him to confess to crimes that the prosecution hadn't been able to prove independently. By trying to make me look guilty, I said slowly, he'll have to make himself look even guiltier. Exactly. And when the jury hears Derek Morrison explain how he targeted elderly women, gained their trust, and systematically robbed them blind, they're not going to see you as his accomplice. They're going to see you as the one victim who was smart enough and strong enough to fight back. I left the DA's office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Derek Morrison had made one final mistake. He'd assumed that because I'd beaten him, I must be like him. But the truth was simpler and more satisfying. I'd beaten him precisely because I was nothing like him. Derek was a predator who survived by targeting the vulnerable. I was a woman who'd spent 40 years teaching teenagers, managing finances, and solving problems that seemed impossible until you broke them down into manageable pieces. Derek thought he was playing chess with a naive widow. I'd been playing chess with a man who didn't even realize he was in the game. And soon, a jury would hear exactly how that game had ended. The trial of Derek Morrison began on a crisp January morning, exactly 4 months after his arrest in my backyard. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing my best navy suit and feeling like I was about to watch the final act of a play I'd been writing for months. Emma sat beside me, her hand tight in mine. The past 4 months had been difficult for her. Not just the betrayal and humiliation of discovering her fiancé was a career criminal, but the process of rebuilding her sense of trust and judgment. She'd been in therapy, had moved back into her own apartment, and was slowly becoming the confident, independent woman I'd always known she could be. Derek sat at the defendant's table looking like a man who'd aged 5 years and 4 months. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting public defender's ensemble. His hair was graying, his face was drawn, and his eyes held the kind of desperate calculation that comes from knowing you're about to lose everything. His lawyer, a tired-looking man named Bradley Fitzgerald, had indeed decided to pursue the strategy Patricia Hernandez had predicted. According to the opening statements, Derek Morrison was certainly guilty of financial crimes, but he'd been manipulated and controlled by a criminal mastermind who'd used her age and apparent vulnerability as cover for sophisticated fraud schemes. That criminal mastermind was, allegedly, me. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Fitzgerald had said during his opening statement, "my client made terrible mistakes, but he was not the architect of these crimes. The real criminal is sitting in this courtroom today, disguised as a victim." Patricia's opening had been simpler and more devastating. Derek Morrison is a predator who spent 12 years targeting elderly women, stealing their life savings and destroying their lives. His final victim, Clara Brennan, was different from the others in only one way. She fought back. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days, with testimony from Derek's previous victims, evidence of his stolen identities, financial records showing the systematic theft from multiple accounts, and recordings of his conversations with Vincent Torres about the kidnapping plot. By the time Patricia rested her case, Derek looked like a man watching his own execution. Then came the defense's turn, and Bradley Fitzgerald called his star witness, Derek Morrison himself. For 2 hours, Derek testified about his criminal activities in excruciating detail. He described how he'd identified potential victims, how he'd gained their trust, how he'd systematically drained their accounts. He explained his system for creating false identities, his methods for avoiding law enforcement, and his techniques for disappearing when suspicion grew too strong. And then, finally, he began to implicate me. "I met Clara Brennan through her daughter," Derek testified, his voice steady and confident. "At first, I thought she was just another target, but during our second meeting, she made it clear that she knew exactly who I was and what I did for a living. This was news to me, since our second meeting had involved him helping me program my universal remote control, but I kept my expression neutral. Mrs. Brennan told me that she'd been watching my activities for months," Derek continued. "She'd identified my previous victims, tracked my financial accounts, and documented my methods. She said she could expose me to law enforcement anytime she wanted." Fitzgerald led Derek through increasingly elaborate lies about our supposed criminal partnership. According to Derek, I'd demanded 50% of his profits from future schemes in exchange for my silence. I'd helped him identify new victims among my wealthy social circle. I'd provided financial expertise that made his fraud more sophisticated and harder to detect. Mrs. Brennan wasn't a victim, Derek concluded. She was my business partner, and she only turned against me when she realized the Canadian police were closing in and she needed a scapegoat. It was a masterful performance, delivered with just the right combination of remorse and righteous indignation. If I hadn't known it was complete fiction, I might have found it convincing myself. Then Patricia stood up for cross-examination, and Derek Morrison learned what it felt like to be outmaneuvered by someone smarter than he was. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia began, "you've testified that Mrs. Brennan demanded 50% of your profits from future fraud schemes. Can you tell the jury how much money you made from your partnership with Mrs. Brennan?" "Objection," Fitzgerald said quickly. "Relevance? I'll allow it," the judge ruled. Derek shifted uncomfortably. It's difficult to calculate exactly. Mr. Morrison, you've testified that you're a professional criminal with sophisticated record-keeping systems. Surely you can tell this jury how much money you made working with your alleged partner? The partnership was just beginning when I was arrested. We hadn't completed any schemes together. I see. So, in the 18 months that you claim Mrs. Brennan was your partner, you made exactly $0 from this partnership? Derek's lawyer was objecting again, but Patricia pressed on. "Mr. Morrison, you've testified that Mrs. Brennan helped you identify new victims among her social circle. Can you name a single victim you defrauded with Mrs. Brennan's assistance?" "The partnership was in the planning stages." "That's a no, Mr. Morrison. You cannot name a single victim because there weren't any, were there? Because Mrs. Brennan was never your partner. She was your victim, and you're lying to this jury to try to reduce your sentence." What followed was the most beautiful destruction I'd ever witnessed. Patricia systematically demolished every aspect of Derek's story, using his own testimony against him. She showed that his supposed partnership with me had produced no victims, no profits, and no evidence beyond his own desperate claims. More damaging still, she used Derek's detailed descriptions of his criminal methods to prove additional charges that the prosecution hadn't been able to establish before. By trying to implicate me, Derek had confessed to crimes across multiple states and provided evidence that would keep him in prison for decades. The jury deliberated for exactly 97 minutes. Guilty on all counts. As the verdicts were read, Derek stared at me across the courtroom with the kind of hatred that comes from finally realizing you've been completely and utterly outplayed. I met his gaze calmly, thinking about Margaret Wellington, Helen Rodriguez, Janet Pierce, and all the other women whose lives he'd destroyed. Judge Harrison sentenced Derek Morrison to 28 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. The restitution order required him to pay back every dollar he'd stolen, plus interest and penalties, which meant he'd be working prison jobs for the rest of his life to pay back money to the women he'd robbed. As the bailiff led Derek away in handcuffs, I felt Emma squeeze my hand. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm proud of you." Walking out of that courthouse, I realized that Derek had given me something unexpected, proof that I was stronger, smarter, and more resilient than I'd ever imagined. For 2 years after Richard's death, I'd felt like a half-person, defined by what I'd lost rather than what I'd retained. Derek Morrison had tried to make me his victim. Instead, he'd reminded me that I was Clara Brennan, teacher, investor, mother, and woman who didn't back down from a fight, even when the fight came disguised as family. 6 months later, I used part of Derek's restitution payments to establish the Clara Brennan Foundation for Elder Fraud Prevention. We provide education, resources, and support for seniors who've been targeted by financial predators. Emma runs the day-to-day operations, and she's brilliant at it. Turns out, almost marrying a con artist gives you excellent insights into how they operate and how to stop them. As for me, I'm 64 years old, worth approximately $8.5 million, and I've never been happier to be underestimated. Because the next con artist who thinks I'm an easy target is going to discover exactly what happened to the last one who made that mistake. Some lessons, after all, are worth sharing. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.